The Netherlands, December 12, 1942. A crippled American bomber makes an emergency landing on a German-held Dutch airfield. The crew is taken prisoner. The plane, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, is rushed to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's most secret test site. Within days, Erhard Milch, State Secretary for Aviation and the man in charge of Germany's aircraft production, arrives to inspect what Nazi papers called the terror bomber. What Milch found in that hangar shook him, not for what the B-17 could do, but for what it showed. By the time he finished his report, he reached a grim conclusion that many of his superiors refused to accept. The math said Germany was losing the industrial war, and the proof lay on the concrete floor in front of him. Milch was not a party ideologue or a true believer. He was an industrial man, a planner who thought in production rates, supply chains, and cold numbers. Born in 1892, he had been an artillery officer and a reconnaissance pilot in World War I. After the war, he moved into civil aviation and by 1926 was managing director at Lufthansa. He knew planes, factories, and what it took to run air fleets at scale. When Hitler began to rebuild Germany's military, Milch was the obvious man to make the Luftwaffe real. By 1935, he was State Secretary for Aviation, effectively the number 2 in the Air Force, in charge of production, procurement, and planning. His relationship with Hermann Göring was fraught. Göring was a fighter ace, a showman, and a political survivor, impulsive and often clouded by wishful thinking. Milch was the opposite, sober, numerical, and hard-headed. Where Göring wanted hope, Milch wanted capacity. By late 1942, the numbers Milch saw scared him. Even before the December capture, a B-17 had been downed and hauled to Rechlin. The wreck was reassembled and analyzed. On October 28th, Milch visited with senior Luftwaffe officers and engineers. The half-repaired B-17 sat in the hangar while men measured parts and took notes. Colonel Adolf Galland, at 30 already a famed fighter ace and chief of day fighters, circled the bomber and summed up what pilots kept saying: heavy armor, high altitude, strong defensive guns, and great speed. These bombers come back with engines burning and pieces missing. They still land. Milch listened, then gave the numbers, production estimates, component quality, and what this meant for German air defenses. Then he said something that made the room go quiet. He told them that Reichsmarshal Göring had said there was nothing to worry about. Milch disagreed. He warned that enemy bombers would soon fly at 28,000, 30,000 feet. Altitudes where German fighters would struggle to reach them, and where, even if fighters got up, the defensive fire around the big cities would be unlike anything they had faced. He looked at the officers and said plainly, "Things do not look rosy for our large cities." Others tried to be upbeat. One staff officer argued, "We will shoot down 4-engine bombers, as we did twin-engine ones. Losing a 4-engine bomber hurts the enemy more." The others wanted to believe it. But Milch had seen something deeper in the B-17 wreck. It was not just a fine aircraft. It was a production machine built to standards that showed no sign of material strain. That more than any single combat report told him, Germany faced a problem the Luftwaffe could not fix with fighters and hope alone. Shortages, no signs of rushed work, no corner cutting from lack of capacity. And if America could mass-produce bombers, this complex, heavy, and resource-hungry, then Germany faced an opponent whose industry utterly dwarfed its own. That October inspection planted a seed of dread in Milch's mind. When Wulf Hound was captured intact 2 months later, that dread became certainty. December 12, 1942, began as a routine bombing run for the 303rd Bomb Group. 78 B-17s took off from bases in England, bound for the rail yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France, a vital hub feeding German lines to the Atlantic coast. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, 24, piloted B-17F serial 4124585, nicknamed Wulf Hound. It was his 3rd combat mission. The 303rd, called Hell's Angels, was still new to the war, barely a month in. The flight over the Channel was smooth. Then near Rouen, German fighters rose to meet them. Luftwaffe tactics favored head-on attacks, exploiting the early B-17F's weak nose defenses. Bf-109s and FW-190s dove through the formation, cannons blazing. Wulf Hound took hits. A 20mm shell tore through the fuselage, another crippled the No. 3 engine, and machine gun fire stitched holes across both wings. Still, Flickinger held formation, dropped his bombs, and turned for home. That's when disaster deepened. Lagging slightly behind the main group, Wulf Hound was spotted by a Bf-110 night fighter. Its twin cannons raked the bomber. The No. 2 engine lost oil pressure, hydraulics failed, and fuel leaked freely. Flickinger did the math. Over the Netherlands, 2 engines gone, low fuel, damaged controls. England lay across the freezing North Sea. A ditching there meant certain death within minutes. The only option was to land on enemy soil. He chose the nearest airfield, Leeuwarden, a German-occupied Dutch base. As the bomber descended, flak crews watched in disbelief. The gear came down, barely functioning. The plane slammed onto the runway but stayed upright. Within minutes, soldiers surrounded the aircraft. The crew surrendered and spent the rest of the war as POWs. But the true prize was the plane itself. Wulf Hound was the first fully intact B-17 captured by Germany. This wasn't wreckage to rebuild. It was a complete operational heavy bomber, a treasure trove of Allied engineering. Within 48 hours, it was carefully moved to Rechlin. When Milch heard the news, he cancelled everything. This was what he needed, not a burned-out shell, but a perfect example of how America built its war machines. He arrived on December 15th, 3 days after the capture. The B-17 sat on the tarmac, olive-drab paint and white stars, glaring against the grey winter air. Milch walked around it slowly. It was enormous, a 103-foot wingspan, broader than a Ju-88. The fuselage was blunt, heavy, almost ugly, but Milch knew beauty didn't win wars. Performance did. He began with what terrified German pilots most, the guns. The B-17F had evolved since the war's start. Early models were weak in frontal defense, relying on the bombardiers and navigators' handheld guns. But Wulf Hound showed the latest updates, 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 2 in the nose, 2 cheek mounts for wide fields of fire, 2 in the powered top turret, 2 in the ventral ball turret, 2 at the waist, 2 in the tail, and 1 in the radio hatch. The upcoming B-17G would add a chin turret, 15 guns total. By contrast, most German fighters carried only 3 to 5 guns. The Bf-109 had a single 20mm cannon and 2 7.92mm machine guns. The FW-190, 2 30mm guns and 2 20mm cannons. The B-17 carried more firepower than 3 fighters combined. Milch studied the ammo racks. About 400 rounds per gun, over 3,000 total. Each 50-caliber round was massive, 12.7mm, built for anti-vehicle and anti-aircraft use. Weighing around 1.5 ounces and leaving the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second, it hit with terrifying energy. The combined rate of fire across the aircraft formed a defensive storm. Few attackers could survive, combining over 100 rounds per second. Milch did the numbers. A typical 2-second burst from all 13 guns meant over 200 heavy projectiles filling the air. Any German fighter caught in that cone would be torn apart instantly. The thin aluminum skin of a Bf-109 would disintegrate like paper. Pilots had reported it for months. They called B-17 fire a wall of lead. They spoke of watching cannon shells explode harmlessly against bombers, while a single defensive burst could shear a fighter's wing clean off. Now Milch understood why, and what he saw next made it worse. He inspected the turret systems. These weren't crude mounts. They were powered by electric motors and linked to advanced fire control mechanisms. The top Sperry turret could spin 360 degrees in seconds. The ball turret below used a computing gun sight that automatically calculated lead for moving targets. The sophistication was astonishing. German bombers still relied on hand-aimed guns and instinct. The gunner guessed the lead, compensated for aircraft motion, and prayed. American gunners, by contrast, fought as an integrated system. Their arcs overlapped, forming coordinated kill zones. A fighter diving in faced fire from 3 or 4 guns at once, all guided by trained, disciplined crews who practiced teamwork to lethal precision. Milch's notes were blunt. He wrote that German fighters should never attack B-17s from directly ahead or behind. The only survivable angles were steep dives from above or attacks from below the formation's edge, where the ball turret's arc was limited. But those maneuvers required impossible timing and absolute nerve. Many pilots would die perfecting them. After cataloguing the armament, Milch studied the battle damage. Wulf Hound had taken heavy hits, multiple 20mm cannon impacts along the fuselage. The holes were huge. A 20mm shell was designed to obliterate bombers, yet here the damage was contained. The B-17 structure absorbed punishment like armor plate. The internal ribs and spars localized the shock. Instead of tearing the fuselage apart, each hit damaged only its immediate area. Machine gun strikes peppered the wings and tail, dozens of them. Any could have severed control cables or ruptured fuel lines, yet the aircraft had flown, landed, and survived. Then Milch inspected the armor protection. Behind the pilot's seat sat a thick steel plate, angled to deflect incoming fire. The cockpit glass was laminated armor, far stronger than anything in German designs. The navigator and bombardier had steel shielding around their positions, protecting them from frontal and lower shots. Even the radio operator had armor overhead. Waist gunners stood behind reinforced panels. It was obvious the entire design philosophy was alien to German thinking. German engineers obsessed over weight. Every kilogram was an enemy. Lighter aircraft climbed faster, turned tighter, and fought better. So they built at the razor's edge. Thin frames, minimal structure, just strong enough to fly. The Americans had gone the other way. The B-17 was massively overbuilt. Its aluminum skin was thick, its internal spars redundant, its main wing beam like a bridge girder. Why? Because they could. Each Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine produced 200 horsepower. 4 of them gave more than enough lift to carry armor, structure, and fuel. The Americans had chosen durability over finesse, and in combat, that decision was paying off brutally. Milch's mechanic, Hermann Weller, pointed to the engines. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall, look here." The radial design surprised them. The Luftwaffe preferred inline engines, Junkers Jumo or Daimler-Benz, liquid-cooled, efficient and sleek. But they had a fatal flaw: coolant systems. One hit to a radiator or fluid line, and the engine overheated within a minute. A pilot had 60 seconds to shut it down. And in a single-engine fighter, that meant death or capture. The B-17's air-cooled radials had no such weakness. Each cylinder cooled directly in airflow. You could blow off 3, 4, even 5 cylinders, and the engine would keep running, wounded but alive. Reports from England told of B-17s returning home with engines on fire, cylinders missing, whole nacelles shredded, and still flying. Milch stared at Wulf Hound and realized what it meant. America wasn't just building bombers. It was building machines that could take mortal damage and keep fighting. In that moment, the numbers in his head stopped being abstractions. They were death sentences written in aluminum and horsepower. Combined, more than 100 rounds per second. Milch ran the numbers. A 2-second burst from all 13 guns would spray the sky with over 200 heavy bullets. Any German fighter caught in that cone would be shredded. The thin skin of a Bf-109 would tear like paper. Pilots had been saying this for months. B-17 fire was a wall of lead. They watched their shells hit bombers with little effect, while a single defensive burst could rip a fighter's wing off. Milch now understood why, and what he saw next made it worse. He tested the powered turrets. These weren't crude mounts. Electric motors spun them quickly, and fire control gear helped aim. The top turret could turn a full circle in seconds. The belly ball turret used a computing sight that helped the gunner lead fast targets. German gunners still aimed by eye. American gunners operated as a system, their firing arcs overlapping so an attacker faced simultaneous fire from many guns. The crews trained to work together and mass their shots. Milch's note was blunt. Never attack a B-17 head-on or directly from the rear. Only steep dives from above or sudden strikes from below had any chance, and those moves demanded perfect timing and nerves of steel. Many pilots would die trying them. He then walked the battle damage. Wulf Hound had big 20mm holes in the fuselage, hits meant to destroy a bomber, but the damage stayed local. The strong internal frames kept strikes from tearing the whole structure apart. Machine gun holes peppered the wings and tail. Anyone could have cut a control cable or burst a fuel tank. Still, the plane flew home and landed. Milch checked the armor. Thick steel plated behind the pilot, laminated armored glass in the windscreen, armored panels around the nose crew, protection for the radio operator and waist gunners. The B-17's crew stations were defended. It showed a different design idea. German engineers had always fought weight. Every kilo mattered for speed and maneuver. Their planes were built to the edge of strength. The Americans chose the opposite. The B-17's skin was heavy-gauge aluminum, its internal frames robust and sometimes redundant. The main wing spar was built like a bridge girder. Why? Because American engines, 4 Wright R-1820 radials, about 1/200 HP each, could lift that weight. The U.S. traded some performance for survivability, and in combat that choice paid off. One of Milch's mechanics pointed to the engines. The radial layout was unusual to German eyes. Luftwaffe planes used liquid-cooled inline engines, efficient and streamlined, but vulnerable. A single hit to a radiator or coolant line would overheat an engine in minutes, often forcing a landing or loss. Radial air-cooled engines had no such weak spot. Each cylinder cooled in the airstream. You could lose several cylinders, and the engine might still run. Reports from England spoke of B-17s with engines on fire, missing cylinders, and torn nacelles still making it home. Milch read those reports and the factory data together, and the picture became clear. America wasn't building one-off prototypes. These were production aircraft made on assembly lines to tight standards. Good alloys, precision parts, standardized fittings, clean wiring, well-machined hydraulics. There were no signs of shortcuts. German factories, by late 1942, showed strain. Lower-grade materials, looser tolerances, declining quality control as skilled workers were drafted or replaced by forced labor. The captured B-17 showed none of that decline. He ordered production intelligence. The figures he got were alarming. Boeing and other plants were building B-17s at several sites. Forecasts showed 500 per month by late 1943, with plans to push to 700 or 800. For scale, Germany's total single-engine fighter output across all types was only about 300 to 400 aircraft per month. The Americans were set to build more of one heavy bomber than Germany made. Fighters in total, Milch dug deeper into totals, U.S. aircraft. Output for 1943 was estimated at some 85,000 machines. German production for the year was near 25,000, a ratio of roughly 3.4 to 1, but raw counts hid the real gap. A B-17 took about 150,000 man-hours and used roughly 5,000 lb of aluminum to build. A Bf-109 needed maybe 5,000 man-hours and 1,500 lb of aluminum. In effort and metal, one B-17 equaled about 30 Bf-109s. The US was building thousands of B-17s and B-24s plus medium. Bombers, fighters like the P-47, P-51, and P-38 trainers, transports, and still supplying allies through Lend-Lease, while also producing tanks, trucks, guns, and feeding its own people without starving the home front. Sitting at his desk in Berlin, with those numbers, Milch felt the math turn from abstract to fatal. He had known America outproduced Germany, but seeing a fully intact, mass-produced B-17 made the reality visceral. Germany was in an industrial war against a nation that could outbuild it by a wide margin. There was no military way to reverse that. In January 1943, Milch submitted his full report to the Luftwaffe High Command. It was thorough: specs, capabilities, and the few weak spots the B-17 had. He recommended tactical changes. Avoid head-on attacks, try diving strikes from above, concentrate fire on engines. But his closing point went further. Milch's summary warned that the B-17 flying fortress showed a level of industrial strength and production capacity that Germany could not match, and that reality, more than any single weapon, would decide the war. Technological sophistication that surpasses anything Germany can currently match. Its large-scale deployment proves that American industry is operating at a level far beyond previous intelligence estimates. Recommendation: adjust tactics to reduce direct combat with B-17 formations at high altitude. Strategic outlook: continued attrition against a numerically and technologically superior enemy will lead to unsustainable losses. That final sentence was dangerous. It came perilously close to admitting the war was unwinnable. Goering read Milch's report with mounting irritation. At a staff conference later that month, he confronted him directly. "Your report is too pessimistic," he snapped. "Yes, the Americans have resources, but they lack our fighting spirit, our superior pilots. Quality will always defeat quantity." Milch chose his response carefully. "Herr Reichsmarschall, quality requires experience. We are losing experienced pilots faster than we can replace them. The Americans are building replacement aircraft faster than we can destroy them. Then we will build more fighters." Goering barked. "With respect, Herr Reichsmarschall, fighter production is already at its limit. Increasing it would mean cutting bombers, ground attack aircraft, and trainers. Even if we doubled production, we would still be outnumbered 3-1. Goering's face reddened. "Are you suggesting we cannot win?" Milch froze. That was the line he could not cross. Defeatism meant death. "I suggest, Herr Reichsmarschall, that we must be realistic about our industrial position. The Soviet Union outproduces us. America outproduces us. Britain outproduces us. Our only hope is to use our resources more efficiently than they do." It was a neutral statement, neither hopeful nor openly despairing. Goering glared at him for a long moment, then waved the room away. Milch's report was quietly filed, not destroyed. Destroying it would draw attention. No action required. He was not alone. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, knew the numbers too. Germany could not win a production war, but he was powerless to change Hitler's strategy. Adolf Galland, disgusted by unrealistic orders and lack of resources, would soon clash with Goering and lose his command temporarily. Across the Nazi hierarchy, capable men saw the arithmetic of defeat, but learned that admitting it was dangerous. So they spoke in euphemisms or stayed silent. The war rolled on. Wulf Hound itself had a long life after capture. Once examined at Rechlin, it was repainted in Luftwaffe markings and coded DL+XC. During the summer of 1943, it toured fighter bases across Germany and occupied France. Pilots studied its cockpit, gun placements, and structure to understand what they faced. It was part training tool, part psychological armor. If they knew its strengths, maybe they could fight it better. In July 1943, Wulf Hound returned to Rechlin for further trials. Engineers wanted to test its handling, performance, and limits. German test pilots flew it and reported it as stable, steady, easy to control, perfect for bombing, poor for dogfighting. In September, the bomber was transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, KG 200, a special operations unit using captured Allied aircraft for secret missions. Recoded A3+AE, Wulf Hound began covert flights across Europe. Because it looked like an American bomber, it could slip into Allied airspace unnoticed. KG 200 used it to drop agents, run reconnaissance, and deliver supplies to isolated German units. Pilots in the unit respected the aircraft. One wrote, "The Americans built a plane that even an average pilot can fly safely. Our aircraft demand skill. Theirs require only competence." In a long war, that difference is decisive. Milch's predictions soon proved true. B-17s appeared in greater and greater numbers. The 8th Air Force in England was expanding fast. Raids that once numbered a few dozen bombers in 1942 now brought 200-300 aircraft by mid-1943, and by 1944, 1,000-plane raids were routine. Luftwaffe losses grew catastrophic. Veteran pilots were dying, forcing shortened training programs that produced underprepared replacements who died even faster. By late 1944, the average German fighter pilot had just 50 flight hours before combat. American pilots had more than 400. The outcome was inevitable. In April 1945, as the Reich collapsed, Wulf Hound met its end. During an American bombing raid on Oranienburg airfield north of Berlin, the captured B-17 was destroyed on the ground. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, the man who had crash-landed it back in December 1942, survived the war as a POW, unaware that the bomber he once flew had spent 2 years serving both sides of the same war. Analysis to his superiors, but they ignored it because it didn't fit their ideology. When Wulf Hound was captured in December 1942, Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, who had landed it, couldn't have known that he was handing the Germans undeniable proof of their defeat. He returned home after the war and lived into the 1990s, always feeling guilty for delivering an intact B-17 to the enemy. But in truth, it hadn't changed a thing. The outcome had already been decided by arithmetic, not by any single aircraft. By war's end, the US had produced over 12,700 B-17s, more than Germany built of both its main fighters, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, combined. American factories would turn out over 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. German production in the same years reached only about 94,000. One captured bomber couldn't alter those numbers, but it revealed them with undeniable clarity to anyone who chose to see. By May 1945, Germany was finished. The Reich had fallen. Erhard Milch was captured by Allied forces and detained for questioning as a senior Luftwaffe officer involved in weapons production and the use of forced labor. Before his Nuremberg trial, American technical intelligence officers interrogated him for what he knew about German evaluations of Allied aircraft. The session took place in a requisitioned office building in Bavaria. Milch, now 53, sat across from 2 US officers while a stenographer typed every word. One of the officers placed a folder on the table. Generalfeldmarschall Milch, "We found this in captured Luftwaffe archives," he said. "It's your report on the B-17 Flying Fortress, dated January 1943. You examined the bomber captured that December, correct?" "Yes." "In that report, you wrote that Germany couldn't match American industrial output, that continued combat would lead to unsustainable losses. Did you truly conclude that from one aircraft?" Milch hesitated, then spoke plainly. "I concluded that Germany could not win an industrial war against the United States. The B-17 was physical proof, tangible evidence of production capacity beyond our reach." "Explain," the officer said. "Every part of that plane, its engines, alloys, bearings, wiring, required precision industry. The Americans were building hundreds every month, thousands in total. For Germany to build something similar, we would have had to divert nearly all our aluminum, machine tools, and skilled labor. And that was just one design. They were producing many others simultaneously." The officer nodded. "Your report was marked filed, no action required." "Why?" Milch smiled faintly. "Because the Nazi leadership didn't want information. They wanted confirmation of what they already believed. Reality that contradicted ideology was ignored. Did you try to warn anyone?" "I did what I could." But speaking inconvenient truths in the Third Reich was fatal. Those who said Germany couldn't win were accused of defeatism. Some were executed. Silence was safer. The officer produced another document. "Your October 1942 notes mention a crashed B-17. You told Goering, things don't look rosy for our big cities. What did you mean?" "Exactly that," Milch said. "Once the B-17s operated over Germany in numbers, especially with escort fighters, our cities would be destroyed. We lacked the strength to stop them, Too few fighters, too few trained pilots, too little industry. And you knew this as early as 1941? I knew the numbers then. The later examinations only confirmed them. By 1942, the industrial balance made victory impossible. The B-17 simply made that visible. The interrogation lasted several more hours as Milch outlined production limits, resource shortages, and strategic misjudgments. Finally, one officer asked, if someone had listened to you in 1942, could Germany have changed the outcome? Milch shook his head. No, by then it was already over. Perhaps if we had never started the war or chosen a different strategy at the beginning. But by December 1942, when I studied Wulf Hound, the result was inevitable. America had too much industry, too many resources, too much capacity. Examining that bomber was like diagnosing a terminal illness. I could identify the cause, but there was no cure. The story of Erhard Milch and the captured B-17 Wulf Hound is a miniature of Germany's broader failure in World War II. A capable engineer uncovering an undeniable truth. Germany had lost the industrial war long before it lost the military. One and a leadership too. Blinded by ideology to face it, he submitted his assessment to superiors, but it was ignored. Milch's experience was far from unique. Albert Speer knew Germany couldn't win an industrial war. Adolf Galland knew the Luftwaffe was being drained beyond recovery. Field commanders on the Eastern Front understood the Soviet Union's vast, endless resources. Intelligence officers knew the scale of American production made defeat inevitable. Across the German state and military, capable men grasped the arithmetic truth, but they were trapped within a regime where truth bowed to ideology, where acknowledging reality was treason, and where leadership believed sheer will could replace material strength. And so, the war dragged on long after the result was decided. The B-17 Wulf Hound was finally destroyed in April 1945. Mere weeks before Germany's collapse. It had served well as a test platform and intelligence asset, but its most profound impact came years earlier, in December 1942, when it exposed a truth Germany refused to accept. The numbers at war's end made that truth undeniable. 731 B-17s built, more than Germany's combined total of its two main fighters. The Bf-109 and Fw-190, the US produced over 300,000 aircraft. Between 1940 and 1945, Germany, 94,000. B-17s alone dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, part of the 1.5 million tons delivered by American bombers. The Flying Fortress became the emblem of American air power in Europe, central to every major campaign, paving the way for D-Day, shattering factories, oil plants, transport lines, and the Reich's industrial base. But its most devastating effect wasn't physical, it was psychological. German civilians who looked up to see vast daylight formations of bombers flying unhindered grasped what their leaders would not. They faced an enemy with limitless means. Fighter pilots, watching formations that grew larger each month, realized they were fighting a hopeless war of attrition. Engineers like Milch, studying American craftsmanship, saw the cold impossibility of matching such output. The B-17 wasn't just a weapon, it was a message forged in aluminum and steel. America can build more than you can destroy. There's a deeper lesson in this story beyond military history. Milch's tragedy wasn't in misunderstanding the truth. It was that he did understand it too clearly. He measured it, documented it, and paid the price for being right in a system where truth itself was perilous. In Hitler's Reich, reality was whatever the Führer declared. Intelligence that contradicted dogma was labeled defeatism. Officers who questioned strategy were branded disloyal. Engineers who identified technical impossibilities were accused of lacking faith. So capable men stayed silent or buried their honesty in reports that were quietly filed away. Milch's January 1943 report on the captured B-17 was found in May 1945 in a filing cabinet inside a seized Luftwaffe office. The folder bore the mark, "Filed, no action required." Alongside it were other forgotten analyses, warnings about Soviet tank output, Allied shipping strength, synthetic rubber production, and strategic bombing vulnerability. Every one of them was accurate. Everyone ignored, because in Nazi Germany, correctness mattered less than compliance. The mathematician who proved defeat was near had less value than the zealot who promised victory. The engineer who warned of production limits was distrusted, while the flatterer who pledged miracles was rewarded. In the end, faith couldn't change mathematics. Ideology couldn't summon steel. Willpower couldn't replace oil, aluminum, or trained workers. The B-17 Flying Fortress embodied that unchangeable truth, and Milch understood it long before anyone would listen. Today, fewer than a dozen B-17s still fly, preserved by museums and restoration groups. At air shows, their deep rumble carries echoes of that industrial age. Stand beside one and three things strike you immediately. First, the size, enormous, far larger than it seems in photos. The broad wings, the tall tail, the massive frame command respect. Second, the complexity. Where modern aircraft appear smooth and simple, the B-17 bristles with turrets, antennas, ports and hatches, every inch purposeful. And third, the craftsmanship. Inside, the wiring is neat, the rivets perfect, the structure solid. Despite being mass-produced, it was built with care, precision and pride. That's what Milch saw in 1942, not just a bomber, but evidence of an industrial machine that could produce excellence by the thousand. In American museums, restored B-17s stand as monuments to industrial power. But they also stand for something deeper, the value of truth and the danger of systems that punish it. Wars, after all, are won in factories long before they're won in fields. Milch understood that. He tried to say it. And for the next 3 years, he watched the numbers prove him right, exactly as he had warned.